Okay, we might make a start, everyone. We've clearly got a full room, which is great. So Yuma, everyone. My name's Robert Christie. I am the head of the Office of Development Effectiveness at DFAT. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we're meeting, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So why a panel on the global learning crisis and why ODE? Well, ODE has brought together this panel to discuss the global learning crisis because while we've done a little bit of work in this area, we really want to keep unpacking what is actually, we're discovering, a fairly complex area, and one in which clearly, as the evidence will show today, we haven't got right yet. So ODE's been involved in looking at the issues through an evaluation on teachers, investing in teachers, which came out in 2015, and we've also been working with the Australian Centre for Educational Research on their teacher development program, which is working in Vanuatu, Timor and Laos over the last few years. Now, while ODE often does large strategic evaluations, so for example, we've run an evaluation looking back over 10 years at health in the Pacific, and this year we'll also release an evaluation looking back over 10 years at infrastructure in the Pacific. For education, we really want to focus on a subsection of the Pacific, so looking at the countries in was loosely defined as Melanesia, so looking at Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu and Fiji to start with. Starting with the evidence that we have on literacy in particular, and then adopting something of a more iterative, dare I say adaptive approach to sort of unpeel the onion, if you will, and take a closer look at this issue. Part of the idea is to do sort of smaller pieces of work rather than one big evaluation to really try and look at this evidence. And this work will be led by Karen Ovington here today, along with other members of the team in ODE. So ODE's engagement here on literacy will be ongoing, and we'll be engaging with many of you and hope to continue this conversation into the future. Certainly it was wonderful when we saw the program that there are in fact 3 panels on education, so there was one this morning, I think many of you attended. There'll be another one tomorrow as well, looking at learning in particular in Indonesia, in the Belonglo Theatre. Now before introducing the panellists, I would like to thank Rosemary McKay and David Coleman for help at ODE in pulling this panel together. We've worked since, I was looking at the email today, September, with various engagement with the panel members, because we think this is a very important discussion, and as I say, it's one that ODE really wants to be part of. So I know many of you in the room know some of the panel members, but I'd certainly like to welcome Dr Lant Pritchett, Research Director for the RISE program, Fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University, Dr Elizabeth Cassity, Senior Research Fellow at the Australian Council for Education Research, Dr David Coleman, Senior Advisor in Education at DFAT, and Dr Wendy Jarvie, Adjunct Professor at the Public Service Research Group at the School of Business at University of New South Wales, Canberra. So Lant, I'd like to first of all turn to you and ask just what is the global learning crisis and what are the key issues underpinning this challenge? I'm afraid we've only got one microphone today, so we're going to have to pass it around the panel members and paraphrase questions.
Okay. So I think I had 4 slides prepared, which sort of answer the question, and we're intended to keep our answers to 5 minutes. So I hope to hold this to 5 minutes. So the global learning crisis in 4 slides, and this isn't working to advance it, but I'll just do it that way. So first, what we mean by the global learning crisis is that quality is bad, and it's just unbelievably worse than even you might think unless you've actually worked on this. So in some level, people are like, oh, of course, education, learning outcomes are a little worse or somewhat worse or maybe a lot worse than in OECD countries. But you just want to emphasize that the distribution of learning outcomes as measured on a common instrument or assessment like PISA just don't overlap. So the blue bars are the distribution by the PISA levels from 1 and below, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the Netherlands, which is a typical OECD country. The Netherlands devotes a lot of attention and concern that it's got, you know, a substantial fraction of its own 15-year-olds at levels 1 and 2. But if you compare that with the recent PISA-D results of Cambodia, 98% of the 15-year-old population is below level 2. So again, it's not that they're a little bit worse or that these distributions have a different mean. These distributions practically don't overlap, and hence only about less than 3% of all Cambodian 15-year-olds are at level 2 and above, which, by the way, is the SDG target to reach 100%. So, second, the learning crisis is at the top 2 in the sense that the problem isn't that poor, rural, disadvantaged Cambodians have a bad education. The problem is poor, rural, disadvantaged Cambodians are getting no education, and the Cambodian elites are getting a terrible education. So, if you look at the fraction of, you know, kids in Zambia or Cambodia reading at level 1 and above, it's like not 1/10 of 1% or 100th of 1%, it's 1,000th of 1%. Which means, suppose all of the children at level 4 and above, which about 30% of Dutch kids are there, it's kind of not a super high standard, it's above average, but even if all of the kids in Zambia who were at level 4 and above were from some top 1% of elite, however defined, it would still mean only 1/10 of 1% of the elite of Zambia are getting a globally adequate education. So it's not the case that the elite are getting a good education and the poor are getting a bad education. The poor are getting no education at all, and the elite are getting an incredibly terrible education. So that's the second point about the learning crisis. The third is that this is a great betrayal of the hopes and expectations on which children have been induced to get into school. They've been told, you get into school, go on in school, you'll get a good job, you'll have a better life. And they're just being pushed through more and more schooling. But a recent sample in rural India of youth 14 to 18 asked, like, girl goes to bed at 9:30, wakes up at 6:30. In pictorial form, how many hours did she sleep? This isn't even arithmetic. Like, you could answer this question counting on your fingers in one hand, which is how I would answer it. Because there's that tricky part where it goes past noon and starts or midnight and starts over. And it's not surprising that, you know, this is a difficult question for kids without an education, but almost half of the youth who are enrolled in tertiary education get this question wrong. So you have people who are in tertiary education on the premise that tertiary education is preparing for good formal sector jobs who can't practically use time. That is an ongoing and emerging betrayal of the hopes and aspirations of youth versus the preparation they're getting, and that's a learning crisis. And third, more of the same is not going to fix this. This is not getting better. If anything, it's getting worse, and just more of the same, either in terms of pushing more kids through school, or in terms of more of the same of the system that produced this, is not going to fix it. So this is a study that looked at panel data tracking from 2000 to 2014, the schooling status of recent youth, 18 to 24, versus their actual competency in answering simple primary school arithmetic questions. And what happened was about 20 percentage points more of the youth population were finishing all 12 years of secondary education. And the fraction of kids that could, the fraction of kids or the fraction correct on simple arithmetic went down. Didn't go up, it went down. So the idea that just pushing more of the same is going to solve the learning crisis is false. It's big, it's bad, it's not getting fixed. That's the learning crisis.
Okay, so with that introduction, and thanks for sticking to time, we would now like to ask questions of our panel, which are, so we've organised a couple of key questions that we think sort of get to the heart of the learning crisis. So we're just going to run through the panel. Elizabeth, if I could maybe start with you. And the question that we're going to ask is, what is the evidence telling us on learning outcomes in the areas where our panellists are focused? And in fact, could you tell us anything that has maybe surprised you with that evidence? So, Elizabeth.
Should I hold this?
Okay, it's up to you.
So I have to follow that. Thanks. So thank you for coming, everyone. It's great to be able to present. Anyway, I'm going to answer my questions within some of the research that we're doing that Rob alluded to at the beginning of this presentation. For the past couple of years, I've been involved in a DFAT-funded program conducting multi-year studies of teaching quality interventions in Timor-Leste, Laos, and Vanuatu. So the impetus for that study series came from an Office of Development Effectiveness review in 2015 called Investing in Teachers. And in that review, 27 countries, teacher development investments were investigated in 17 country programs. And those questions that were asked in that review were what were the conditions of success and to what extent have investments contributed to improved outcomes. Scary finding, almost no data on outcomes, teaching outcomes that could be attributed to DFAT's teacher investments. That issue of attribution is a tricky one anyway that we can talk about later. So as a result of that, there was a recommendation out of that report that DFAT should work systematically to improve its monitoring and evaluations of the outcomes of investments in teacher development. So here we are about 3 years later into that study. So to answer the first part of the question, what is the evidence telling us about teaching quality and learning outcomes? At ACER, we tend to refer to teaching as a noise-filled context, and the fact that schools themselves are very complex places. Student learning is not only about academic outcomes. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for good data and a good assessment data that monitors how kids are performing in schools. However, we do need to consider that it's also student engagement, including we need to know about student well-being and interest in lessons, learning, and achievement. In fact, students who perceive teachers that are caring and supportive feel themselves to be much more engaged in a supportive learning environment. So there's a lot of links between teacher support, student engagement, and academic performance as important predictors of student success. So assessment and monitoring, as I've said, it is important and it needs to be available and interpretable to a wide range of people so that teachers can understand what students know and can do. But classrooms and teachers do need to respond to all of those challenges. So complexity, that's not a great answer, but learning is very holistic. So then Rob asked, what have I been surprised about? So I thought about this research. 2 surprises, one a bit frustrating and the other a bit of a nice surprise. Data, unfortunately, was the frustrating challenge for us. There's a lack, especially in one country that we're researching, a lack of ongoing and consistent student learning outcomes data. In fact, nothing since a mini AGRA in 2017. That doesn't really help us in knowing about what students know and can do, especially in the early years. And there's a lot of difficulty, that surprised me as well, in getting any data for secondary analysis, and it's not only with that particular place. But a positive, pleasant surprise in the research that we've done is program responsiveness in fact, in that very same country, has been using a mentoring model of teacher support. And they've been revising that mentoring model that might work to support teachers a little better. They've been developing some targeted student assessments in literacy and numeracy. They've just been a one-off, but let's see where they go. And they've been adjusting the program to meet the needs of all schools. So rather than rolling the program out to just a few select schools in a municipality, they've rolled it out to all schools in a particular municipality, and that seems to do well politically. It's early days, but this program, I was pleasantly surprised that they are taking on board some lessons learned. It's in its 5th year right now of working. So they've learned from lessons, and I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Sorry about the Thank you. Okay, thanks. Now next we have Wendy. Jarvie, I'll just line up. It is. I was told of the importance of Q&A for everyone, so here we go.
Okay, I'm Wendy. I'm basically a bureaucrat who got into the World Bank by some miracle, and I've been working with them ever since. But most of I cannot put that on. Right, failed the first test. Righto, so I'm going to talk about Insights from Pearl, program World Bank Global Partnership for Education program in the Pacific. And yes, there is a learning crisis. I agree with that, although I don't like to talk about crisis for the Pacific. I call it a challenge because I'm a bureaucrat and we don't call it a crisis. You can say that, I can't, right? And countries have found it in the Pacific relatively easy to lift numbers in school, but harder to improve outcomes. Pacific, very great challenges. There's been a really good blog just put out on Pilnar at the Development Policy Centre, anyway, that shows you that about 50% of kids in Year 4 in the Pacific don't reach the literacy benchmark, the Pacific benchmark. But the problems start early. Preschool's patchy, many children not school ready. And in talking about things like this, we've done lots of studies and things, but only 34% of children in grade 3 can read fluently. The kids aren't learning to read. They're not starting school ready, and they're learning to read too slowly in their school. So what happened? I like this one because bureaucrats respond to it. This is an example showing in Tonga 2014 that of the kids this is the end of Year 1. They've been in school a year. A quarter of the kids, 1 in 4, does not know the sound of any letter. 0. They've spent a whole year learning to read. 0. So you can get bureaucrats to focus on 0. It's really quite interesting. Anyway, so Pearl came in, Pacific countries wanted it, blah, blah. Did 3 things. Playgroups for children 0 to 5, not preschool, playgroups, very important, I'll come back to that later. Early grade reading, really, really structured reading. Program for teachers, and they did a whole lot of capacity building as well. And furthermore, because they're the World Bank, we did randomised control trials. And I learnt a lot doing that. I won't say any more about that, except to say I love randomised control trials. I really love them. But, right, okay. But what I wanted to show, I'm really having trouble with this. But what I wanted to show you was that we got results quickly, and this is the thing that really quite surprised me. Everybody says it takes ages to get results and improvements, but if you can focus on something, you can get it quickly. So the playgroups basically operated through what the parents did. The parents and the children came, the parents were expected to do more things at home. And within a year, the parents were doing more at home, so the monitoring being read to, it increased. Told stories, name counted to. We got changes started to change within that year, and I can't do it in 2 minutes, but I will try. When they got to school the next year, in 2016, letter sounds. These are the kids who went to the playgroups, these are the kids who didn't. We're getting changes. The bank got changes in that sort of time. And the impact, we did the RCT, truly wonderful things. Anyway, it worked. That's all I will say, it worked. And from low doses. 2 to 4 hours a week. This is low dose stuff. This violates a lot of the principles of early childhood education. Very inexpensive, $12 a head, guys, $12. Have I got a deal for you? You know? Okay. The early grade reading, much more expensive, $62 per child, but worked really well, and the teachers did it. The teachers did it. 93% implementation, doing the implementation correctly. This is unbelievable figures. So it shows you can do programs that teachers will implement. Okay, and they all learned a hell of a lot more. Going really fast. Yeah, went from 18 to 29. So what did I learn from this? Do I have another minute? 44 seconds. Okay, my first point. It is possible to get significant improvements in short periods of time. It takes a lot of preparation, absolutely. A lot of work, but it doesn't take years to get results. It doesn't have to cost a lot. And I have to tell you, the playgroups were just as cost effective as the teaching in schools. And there's an incredibly impenetrable but wonderful World Bank paper that shows this. I can't actually read it, but there's lots of equations and things. And they generate a lot of support, and the teachers will change teaching practices. They will change it. You give them the right stuff, you give them the coaching, you work with them, they will. And I might come back to this, the biggest resistance to the results, I have to say, it's from the outside experts who go, yes, but we don't like the way that's working in the classroom. Yes, but, and I will leave it there. But then I have to say, all of this is probably evidence-based, that is not. That's me.
I now turn to you with this question for views, maybe on RCTs.
David?
Yeah, sure. I was going to put you at the end as we discussed earlier, but you can go now. Yep. Pardon?
They've all gone.
Yeah, but sure, Lant, not on this question, but that's okay. Over to you. No, David, if you're ready.
I don't have a slide, so do you want me to go up there?
Come up and talk.
I'm in trouble. No, I'll be quick, and I'll try to be... Thanks. Is this the skill testing test thing? Yeah. I'll try to be quicker here to maybe buy some time later, and because I'm not really supposed to talk right now. Oh no! Go. So I'll just say really quickly, I guess one of the things I was going to mention, because you were saying what is kind of relating to the learning crisis point, is some slightly different stats, and that's a problem in itself, because we talk about things when, Lant talks, you kind of want to slit your wrist a little bit when you go, there's no learning whatsoever. But I think part of the challenge is sort of figuring out, okay, how do we get some optimism, as Wendy was talking about, what are some areas where we can see some traction, and yet at the same time having some compelling figures. So one of our partners, the UNESCO Institute of Statistics, has been doing a lot of numbers. As we heard from Jonathan Glennie, the SDGs are much more ambitious, right? And so as we know, this group around here, under education, much more ambitious and very focused on learning. And so the main stat that they've been putting out to try to mobilize the world, and I think Jonathan would be happy here because it is thinking about the whole world, is, but this is the bad part, something like 617 million kids, and so that children and adolescents are not meeting minimum reading and mathematics standards, right? So what is that number? What does that mean in perspective? That is about 6 out of 10 kids globally, right? And so the point that they're trying to make is this isn't just in developing countries. There might be some of the tiny elements within, say, the Netherlands, or it might be indigenous communities, or people who are specifically underprivileged, et cetera, the various forms of marginalization that we know about. So trying to make that inclusive story, so Jonathan might give us a high five for that. So that's kind of a bit of a stat. So just to be really quick, but part of that is we're still in kind of best guess territory with a lot of this stuff, right? Learning assessments and the comparability therein is still an incomplete project. And so while we can use these statistics, sometimes, I think some of what Lant was talking about was examinations, other times there's standardized assessments. How do we make sure that we're actually comparing, but not comparing to punish, right? Which I think is Wendy's point, that it isn't like, oh, it's a league table and your country is in terrible strife and then therefore, just give up. It isn't compare and despair. It's about trying to get that information, ideally, for a sense of empowerment. So let me just quickly say, before the clock starts being thrown at me, is a couple of things that are surprising or interesting. A positive message is, get pretty much everywhere that I've seen, and certainly the areas where DFAT is focused, is that if you give girls half a chance, their results go up, and much faster than boys. So if you look at the PILNA blog that came out on Thursday at a very wonderful website, the DBC blog, it showed that girls are outstripping boys quite significantly over a trend line, right? So that's a really good news story, that girls given half a chance will have better results and better than boys. But if we step outside of education, and I think it's worthwhile doing that a little bit, is then when you think about post-school outcomes, whether that's in terms of jobs or leadership or productive lives and so on, that's not changing. And so that's really challenging, thinking about, well, what is happening at a societal level? That girls wonderfully, where they get a chance to get an education, will prosper and will tend to have better results, but their post-school outcomes are not changing. Leadership figures are not getting better. Girls are not getting access to jobs. So what does that mean in terms of cultural choice? And what's happening in terms of the incentives around, does a better education, what does it lead to? It isn't all just extrinsic, of course. It isn't just measurable in terms of jobs and so on, but it is clearly a factor. And so I just wanted to just touch on that, and I might just, so that, because I know I'm borrowing Rob's time, just sort of stop there. But I will just throw one thing to Wendy, and this is something that we are absolutely always trying to celebrate, is on the one hand, when you're in a situation of 0 scores, those situations that all of our panelists have pointed to, where kids may have no demonstration of any kind of learning that has happened. But when you do targeted investments, which can be, as Wendy was describing so eloquently, they can be small, they can be short, you can get a bounce very rapidly. And in terms of the policy-making practice and getting the attentions of politicians, that is persuasive. It's harder once kids are kind of further along, but when you're in a 0 score situation, which sadly exists either in countries or in pockets of countries, a small, short intervention can make a really big difference, and then politicians go, okay, I'm listening to you, now let's talk about the harder stuff. So I'll pause there. Oops. There it is. So I failed the test.
Okay. So, sorry about the confusion to the panellists with the questions, but Lant, did you want to, I mean, you outlined the global learning crisis in the broad, but was there anything around sort of the evidence that has surprised you over time? Is there anything that, you know, that's telling us about the areas where you focus that you wanted to add to, or we could just, I'm happy to move on to the next one.
I guess I didn't. I was surprised that I guess the thing that surprised me is that in at least 2 countries in which we have reasonably comparable data, that it was getting worse. Because there are lots of reasons to think it would get better. Incomes were going up, Indonesia in particular, incomes were going up, spending was going up, the government wasn't like completely evil and indifferent to the plight of its people. There were perpetuous conditions for it getting better, and so the fact that it got worse, I think, was actually pretty surprising, because lots of other things were getting better in ways that would have led you to be reasonably optimistic about not huge improvements, but modest improvements. So the fact that it got worse was quite surprising.
Right, great, thanks Lant. So now we're going to move on to development partners and what the panel thinks that development partners should do differently to address the crisis. And really, you know, what are some of the key messages that education champions need to give? How do we cut through? And speaking of great blogs, there was one from Michelle, as David mentioned, Michelle Belisle at SPC, but also a great one from Wendy on Friday as well, talking passionately about education. I know so many of you in this room are passionate education champions. So how do we, what are the messages that need to be given about the importance of education, but also really about how to make education more effective? How do we get that best bang for the buck, which has been mentioned, and really great examples from Wendy. All right, so now is this, did you want to go last on this one, Wendy? And then, so we can just start, we just work down the panel. Pardon? Yep, all right, done. So we'll start with, I know Wendy's got some controversial stuff to end on, so we will. Let me kind of start.
We're not going to start controversial.
That's right. Land is never controversial.
So I think I think the first thing about donor engagement is that the big issue that faces education systems around the world is a shift from super successful, wildly important, no question that it was worthwhile expansion of access, to focus on, now that nearly every kid is in child, making sure kids are in school and learning. And it is not yet clear that the general donor and development community is on the do no harm side of that transition yet. There's a lot of inertia and denial and not really coping with the magnitude of the changes that we're going to need relative to business as usual to shift this. And the fact that the development community is still making massive amounts of money available to countries that aren't measuring, committed to, or working on learning progress, I think puts them on the not positive side of do no harm. So if you ask what can the global community do to be part of the solution, it's be part of the solution.
Do you want me to use my last slide, or should I just?
Yeah, sure, I'll bring it up.
Oh, I can just talk in here. Oh, okay.
I don't have a next slide.
Oh,
You're like ahead of the game here.
I follow the rules.
Not a straight line. More competency.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm the right person to say what should development partners do differently to address the learning crisis, but I guess I have a couple of ideas. And as I've already said, you know, my research is focused on teachers and student learning from that perspective. But and as I've already said, there's a wide range of contextual factors that enable and constrain any kind of productive investments in teachers. Budgetary constraints and political priorities in schools, certainly in a national context. So. I've asked questions before about sustainability, but I do think, I agree with the aspect of quick wins. I think quick wins are really important in getting sort of governments, partners on board. However, I think investing in systems is also important, and that takes longer term thinking. Investing in assessment systems, and assessments take years to sort of get right. We're constantly tinkering around the edges to make sure we're doing the right thing by students, asking the right questions, targeting them in the right way. So investing in systems, investing in teaching systems. It's great to have sort of a cascade training program, bring teachers to a central area for a week and let them for example, with investing in teaching systems that focus more on mentors, coaching, some sort of long-term aspect in thinking, like how do you build good teachers and good teaching quality? This is really pie-in-the-sky stuff. I don't think I really know that right answer. I do know these multi-year kinds of studies can be very costly. Any kinds of multi-year investments are costly and they require that ongoing support. So maybe I'm not so positive about that. What I am positive in my passion project is partnership approaches, I think. Approaches that rely on things like trust, listening, feedback. I think they really work. I think a strong collegial culture of mutual trust and support among partners, if the environment is right, I believe that that can work. And certainly, I guess the last thing, that everyone involved in a program focused on students, focused on teachers, need to be committed to promoting student learning and well-being, because I mean, I think students are the focus at the end of all this.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I guess for me, I would just sort of talk a little bit about focus, and I think I'm one of the rare education people who's actually not an economist, but I want to just introduce the concept of supply and demand, and just sort of to unpack that a little bit. And so we often, when we're thinking about the improvement of education systems, we're thinking about the supply side, right? It's thinking about teachers, it's thinking about appropriate curricula, it's thinking about learning materials, infrastructure, all those elements which are kind of inputs going into a system, right? And naturally there has to be a lot of focus on that, and we need to do that better, and we need it to be relevant and appropriate, etc., and thinking very carefully about that side. And so in terms of what Elizabeth was raising, absolutely, that's talking about systems. And if you think about the DFAT education strategy or any education strategy you want to look at, they focus on systems. So I think there's no dispute. We have to be thinking about systems and that integration. And I think it's a term, Lant, that you talk about coherence, right? Where you're trying to get all those elements on that sort of supply side rolling together so that they are fitting up to a whole which is in support of student learning. An area where I think we're underdone, though, is on the demand side. And this is where personally, I think we need as agencies and as partners to be thinking about is understanding a bit more of the socio-cultural aspects of education. And so, as Lant was saying, we have around the world, amazing access to education. There's still 260 odd million kids who have no access to schooling, so that's certainly not done. But when you actually start unpacking it, young people are falling out of the system. So you have in many, many countries near universal access into grade 1, but then by the time you get to grade 6, for example, then the numbers are dropping off, and then the learning outcomes associated with that and the weaknesses therein. And so what I'm trying to get to is trying to understand how are people making their rational decisions. So if we look at the situation, some of the statistics that have been up there, if you're in a situation where there was possibly very little education happening, because teachers aren't present, because they are undertrained, there are limited resources, etc., families are going to make rational decisions about how to utilize their time. If they can see that their child is getting very, very little education, why be there, right? So first you have to understand about the decisions that they're making. Similarly, not to be continuing this grim line of thought, but if people cannot see how an education is going to quote unquote benefit them, right? If they can see that no one in their social milieu through an education is getting a better job, a better livelihood, a better whatever is important to them, then why engage? So I think understanding what is on the demand side, because as I think people who are turning into the more optimistic, by focusing on the quality of education, the quality of learning, is an important access and retention feature, right? In the waning days of the MDGs, people were saying we still have to work on the access story. But if people are going in and the schooling is giving them almost nothing, why should they stay? So quality is integral to that. So are they actually getting the intrinsic benefits of learning, being literate, numerate, and therefore the benefits that can flow on, as we know, to gender equality, to better health outcomes, etc., plus the extrinsic benefits which can relate to jobs, livelihoods, and the other benefits that can come through their participation through an active adulthood. By understanding that a bit better, I think there's an opportunity to bring a better tailoring of that supply side with the demand, so understanding the cultural domains that are happening in societies that can help people feel more motivated and can see the actual relevant benefits of an education today.
I've got a slide.
Yep.
Okay, so mine's slightly different. So I'm an early childhood person. So what am I going to say? Invest in early childhood development and preschools. That's obvious. But it's so often that that's what's missed out. And by the way, and I'm not saying only invest in high quality. I am saying invest in, particularly in low literacy environments, and I take your point, David, that it's actually easy to get lifts in literacy if in a low literacy environment. It doesn't take much. So the work we did in Tonga showed that any sort of preschool works. Any sort of preschool makes a difference. Those playgroups with volunteer facilitators, they're trained for a week. They get a support visit once a term. That's it. They were able to get those improvements. In those sorts of environments, you do not need top of the range. You don't need those high quality. You just need to get something started, and you can start on lifting literacy. Also invest more in early childhood development more broadly. I didn't even mention stunting and nutrition issues in the Pacific. I will, if someone wants to ask me about that, I can talk for hours. Don't ask. Right, so review the experts we are using. I think this is the controversial bit. I think we need to review the experts we are using. A lot of them do not actually believe in measuring student outcomes. A lot of them, I'm being a bit radical here, aren't I? Shall I tone it down? I'll tone it down. I think it was just that I was so many people, and I'm the same because I'm a preschool person, and by the way, I didn't want to do playgroups. I thought, I don't want to do I want to do preschools. I know about preschools, they work. I was forced to do playgroups, but now I see that playgroups work. You've got to move out of your comfort zone. Too many experts are in their own discipline. They've been doing it for 20 years, and they want to keep doing that. They don't want to do anything new, and some of this requires doing new stuff. Okay, so I've just said, don't throw out your experts. I'm saying review your experts. Is that nuanced enough for you? Right. See, I'm being bureaucratic again. Always measure student learning. That is absolutely central. But the next one is act on the results, and if it doesn't improve, change what you're doing. I actually was going to throw it out, but I'm being nuanced, so change what we're doing. I've been a bureaucrat a long time. I was a bureaucrat a long time. Sunk cost, people really are reluctant to drop something even if it's not working. So let's muscle up. Let's change. For political support, we've talked about this, design investments and support to develop quick wins, because that builds your social, your capital. I think a number of people talked about that. But the other thing is, if you want to sell it, you've got to emphasise links to the other agendas that are really sexy. The really sexy ones like your infrastructure, your labour mobility, really, you've got to really show how it's necessary. If you want to get your infrastructure agenda up, you're going to have to invest in this. You don't have to be investing in remedial, learning for reading for your apprentices. That's a waste of time. Can I mention on ECE interventions? It's really important to emphasise their role in supporting the culture. That's one thing I learned very well. We had huge support in Tonga, Tuvalu, those places where we did the playgroups, because that was embedded in the culture. And it was seen to be supporting the strengthening of culture and family bonds. Really important. And I think I'm really out of time, but the one thing I wanted to say there is that, and I think it was obvious, is literacy requires effort beyond schools and education ministries. You can do quick wins, but if you want to get up to a really good standard, you need to be doing things at every single level in your society, at the rules and regulations and legislation, how you fund, how you do your health system as well, if you really want to get it. But it's very hard to do this. I think someone was mentioning whole of government is difficult. Did you mention that, Lant? No, somebody was talking about this morning, I think. It's really hard to do that, but it's really, really important, because that will also build support for your agenda. And also to build demand, and I take David's point. You can build demand for a lot of this early childhood stuff by engaging with business and parents, and that can be really quite effective. And my last one there is, nobody's mentioned it, better graphics and communication. I've seen some of the most appalling graphics and complex graphics in the education world that doesn't sing to politicians, you have to have someone up there explaining what all the various bits are. A little bit of investment in graphics and communication. It's worth it. Okay.
Okay, so thanks for coming. I most appreciate apologies for the slightly fascist approach on time, but it is all worth it now, because you have 45 minutes to ask as many questions as you like within that time of panel members. So why don't we take, now this is something I don't know whether that came up, I forget whether it came up in your lecture. It certainly came up at DFAT, Lant, your view that in fact this is less Q&A as comment and respond. And so we'll aim for questions, but if you've got a comment, it's really up to the panel whether they actually respond, because the comment might be holistic in and of itself and perfectly placed. So we will take a series of 3 questions at a time. And then I just ask panellists to just pick whichever one you wish to, and we'll try and make sure there are no orphan questions out there. Okay, so, and I'll try and paraphrase the questions for the microphone. Yes, please.
Okay, we've known for a long time the benefits of early childhood education, but good experts up there. Have you noticed that what's the terminology? Partner governments, parents, communities, businesses are actually buying it and following it and willing to engage? Or do they still think that, children up to 5 or 6 should stay at home with mum?
Excellent question. Thank you. Okay, yes, please.
Sort of to Wendy, I was just wondering, it's been a few years since the Pearl program. I was just wondering, given it was a quick win, like in terms of you got some good results, if you went back now, what would you see? What would be what's stuck, I guess?
Okay, and any last question, Rosemary, please.
There's different words for this crisis, whether it's a crisis or a challenge or a problem. How do we move from talks of crisis to planned action based on evidence rather than rearguard actions by government or development partners to fix the crisis?
Okay, so thanks. And just for the camera there, so 3 excellent questions. One on early childhood education, basically our partners as a whole, in which we're working on, right through from not just partner governments, right through the parents, buying the evidence about the power of early childhood education. Belinda had a question on Pearl to Wendy, and then a question from Rosemary, if I paraphrase correctly. Should we, crisis gets a headline and gets attention, but in fact we need to work through on solutions. All right, now, and I'll pass this along. Lant, do you want to grab a crack at
Why don't we start with
Wendy? Yeah, sure.
questions for Wendy.
Thank you for your question, Gay, on early childhood education. I think
I've added about 3 other bits, but I'll
okay.
torment you.
Cool. In the Pacific, they are certainly stepping up. There have been a number of conferences and people are seeing, and we've got ministers all signed up, saying they want to do more on early childhood education. I know a number of the countries are talking to the bank about loans, but I don't know if anybody from you knows what's going on? No? Okay. About the next phase of development. So yes, but it's always a struggle to keep engaged. And every so often you'll get, I'll tell you the best thing is, every so often a business person will stand, a businessman will stand up and say this is important. And I know that sounds really sexist, but that's what you need. You need businessmen, to stand up and say it's important if you want to get governments to do it. So I see movement, yes I do.
Is there any progress with our own government and within the DFAT programming program?
I would have to ask DFAT to talk about DFAT programming priorities. But so can I just, but I just want to say that in terms of Pacific Island countries are no different to any other country. Some, they can see evidence and sometimes they'll act and sometimes it takes a while. So when I think of your question about what's happening now, Tuvalu and Kiribati are going pretty strongly on the reading program, and I don't know if Kiribati is doing playgroups, but certainly Tuvalu is. In Tonga, I know they're talking about doing more on that early childhood. I know the playgroups are still continuing, particularly in Vavau, even without government support while they're regrouping. But I don't expect governments to immediately act on evidence, I really don't. They're just, we're in Australia. Anyway, so, just one word about crises. I'm a partner bureaucrat. Never waste a good crisis. Always use a good crisis to get something up.
I'll just talk about ECE really quickly. I guess one thing is that absolutely within the DFAT education strategy, the first area is early childhood, right? So that's getting the foundations right. And so that has been a focal area for us for a whole number of years. Not to say that it's easy though. Governments around the world underinvest in early childhood. And so a man that we often evoke is James Heckman, who's a Nobel laureate in economics, who had something called the Heckman curve, which effectively just demonstrated that investment at the early years are absolutely by and far and away the greatest return on investment of anything you can make. Right, so when we're trying to make the case, you're running in a whole bunch of different ways. There's the kind of econometric, there's the societal inclusion, there's the multi-sectoral, thinking about nutrition, healthcare, child development in a more general way, and then seeing, in many ways, we characterize early childhood as setting the foundations for the child to then enter school. Because some people say, why do you have early childhood in an education strategy? And it's fundamentally because it is if early childhood is done in a multi-sectoral way, so it is not just education in a positive way where child gets a good start, then the child has a much better chance of, yes, learning, but also being healthier, more capable, and so on to be able to get the benefits of their life. So it is an ongoing challenge, but it certainly, a lot of governments, including our own, are often impatient and want to focus on youth, right? They're jumping to youth. And so it's an ongoing challenge for any of us in this sector to be saying, but it's the returns start early, and we have to keep our focus on early childhood and a good, productive primary education where kids are getting foundational literacy, numeracy, critical thinking skills, and the soft or whatever 21st century skills, whatever you want to term it, that all of that starts there. And if you miss that moment, your remedial costs of trying to catch up with youth who don't have functional literacy and numeracy, when you're thinking about skill development and so on, it can still be done. It's just a lot harder and it's a lot more costly. So we're ongoing. So I guess that just allows me really quickly to kind of relate to Rosemary's, is that we're often trying to, you flip-flop, because different audiences. Some audiences respond more to crisis, and some are more about the positive, and often you mix. Because if it's too much of a crisis, and I'm not sure how the Cambodian government would like to see some of those statistics, because sometimes people can feel very fatalistic when you're just saying the whole thing is dire. Whereas when you can see some glimmers, and so certainly around the PILNA result, the Pacific Island Literacy and Numeracy Assessment that was completed in 2018, there's dark and light there, right? And so it's about trying to celebrate the successes that are there as a way of catalyzing action for the bits that are undone. So that's often, I guess, for us to try and get that balance right.
So I can try and address two questions. In terms of early childhood, I think Wendy's already mentioned there's several initiatives at the regional government level, so the Pacific Islands. Pacific Regional Education Framework has one of its 4 key priorities is to monitor early childhood education, but that is also dependent on UNICEF completing a curriculum review, and they haven't yet started that, and I think that's planned for 15 countries. So there's a lot of excitement and initiative in terms of in terms of early childhood education. It seems like all the players are there and in place. I guess we just need things to happen, and it's been a pretty slow process, about 2 years going now, since those first agreements were made by the ministers of education.
Like at least 40 years of education research demonstrating this.
Yeah. But in terms of like what's happening right now, yeah, I agree. The other thing, how to move from crisis to action, I don't know, but I'm thinking about PILNA, and at ACR we've been involved for the 2015 and 2018 cycles in supporting the Education Quality Assessment Program to conduct those assessments. There's been, it was pretty, David mentioned dark and light in terms of PILNA, and in 2012 when the results were released, they were very negative. Students weren't performing, it was all dire. The reporting was done in such a way that the language was really negative. There was just absolutely no hope for anyone. So that was definitely 2012 PILNA results were a crisis. They were, and something else needed to be done. So since we've sort of been supporting some of the reform around PILNA, around the instruments and the analysis, and there's been a change in language, and certainly that's due to sort of the leadership around PILNA within the regional governments, as well as the Education Quality Assessment Program. But thinking, okay, we've got these results, even phrasing results in a much more positive language, like, well, kids are starting to do better here, not like they've done really horrible in year 4 literacy or something. So maybe even changing the language, and I guess that's one example of a big assessment that is moving slowly, very, very slowly, some ministers to action, and actually wanting to look at that data and actually use that data in a much more positive way, I think, that can be used for policy making. It's still happening. It takes a long time, but yeah, that's one of those learning crisis to action examples I can think of.
So just on the crisis to action question, I think the first step is stop letting people plan to fail. I mean, education sector plans that donors and others are funding, including governments, are plans to do more of the same when the same hasn't worked. Like, that's just bizarre how complacent and accepting people are, that they see a crisis and say, how are we going to solve the crisis? Oh, we're going to do more of exactly the same that produced the crisis that we have. So I'm not super convinced that there aren't effective things that do that one could construct around a plan, but what passes for an education sector plan is a list of things they plan to do, not a plan to succeed. And so as long as we're complacent that an education sector plan is a list of things you plan to do, as opposed to a list of things that you plan to do that will accomplish the objective in some numerically informed, evidence-informed way, then I don't think we're even at step one. And my kind of crude read is we're not at step one. Donors and the development community are still allowing plans to fail to be accepted as plans.
Thank you, panelists. It's fabulous. So, next round of questions or comments. Okay, down the front.
Hi, I'm Emily Schmidt from the International Food Policy Research Institute. I have a question on, I don't work in the education sector, but I'm curious in terms of how flexible the system is. So there were a few comments that struck me. One was girls have, given half a chance, have better results than boys. This immediately makes me say, why? Is it because there's greater demand on time for labor of boys? Is that what we need to be looking at in terms of allowing greater access? So where is that in terms of the analysis? The other question, and perhaps more aimed towards Lant, is I'm curious, you showed some really compelling graphs between Cambodia and the Netherlands. And I would imagine some of the studies, and I'd be curious to know what's out there, are controlling for whether you did get 8 hours of sleep, or what is your schooling environment, or is the system flexible enough to allow children to go to school for 4 hours a day and that's all they're going to get because they have to be home to do other things? Or are these studies that you're talking about, are they controlling for all of these other potential factors that are going on in the differences between perhaps a Netherlands economic environment and a Cambodian economic environment?
Okay, thank you. More questions? Yes. Yes.
Hi, Anna Gibert, independent consultant. I guess I was interested in your views around potentially greater spread of the dissemination of results such as PILNA, and I guess that links with your point, Elizabeth, about the framing and actually how the results can potentially be used to catalyse action, and whether perhaps your softer, more positive language is perhaps in a foreign policy kind of environment, what needs to happen at one level, but perhaps if there was more civic awareness. I think I work a lot in Vanuatu, and I get a sense that the kind of results that we as kind of educated or are having access to these reports, I don't personally, from my experience here, that it's very well known in the communities and families, and if there was much greater awareness, and particularly of comparative within the region and the kind of horrifying statistics that you were showing, if there was a much greater sense among civil society and other non-state actors and not the normal suspects and the bureaucrats, what kind of catalyst for more kind of action and that complacency that you're talking about, which is what so many of those countries need, I guess, to make those reform actions. So I guess it's my question around that dissemination, how that can be used to kind of catalyse bottom-up reform.
Thank you. And we've got a lot of hands in the air. I'd particularly also like to see, I know a lot of people have flown in from outside Australia and New Zealand to the conference. So any questions we have, say, from the Pacific or Asia, please come forward. I think, did we have a question in the middle? Yeah, thank you.
Yep, thank you. I'm Sally Baker. I work a lot in inclusive education with a focus on learners with disabilities. Early childhood development is a really critical pathway for learners with disabilities into school. There's evidence that shows when children with disabilities enter through early childhood development or early childhood education, they're more likely to progress onto primary school. But it really requires, and you talked about this too, that there's a real requirement for a multi-sectoral approach. So ministries of education working with ministries of health. And I'm just wondering if you've seen any successful examples of that, of ministries of education and ministries of health working together in a multi-sectoral approach to support early childhood development or early childhood education? And if so, what are the factors that make that work? What are the incentives that make it work for both ministries to work together?
Okay, so we've got three great questions around some of the gender differences that were shown, certainly they're rather striking for Pilner in the Pacific. Civil society, getting civil society on board, catalysing them to shift some of this. I think there's certainly a data issue there that we can dig into, and successful examples of multi-sector support.
So I'm going to combine, in some sense, two questions with, so Vietnam roughly reproduces Netherlands results. So the PISA results for Vietnam are slightly better actually than the Netherlands and kind of reproduce the distribution of kids at all levels of learning. That fact is really super important because it just eliminates all kinds of potential, we couldn't possibly do this in the following context, because Vietnam is about as poor as many other countries. So the results I'm showing you weren't controlling specifically for any of that, but we do have, there's something called the Young Lives data, which has followed the same children from the time they're 2 to roughly 18. And one of the interesting features that has come out of that just in the last few months, so it's not yet well known, is that at age 5, the Vietnamese kids and the kids from the other 4 countries, Ethiopia, India, or a state of India and Peru, look almost identical in terms of assessable cognitive skills at age 5. By age 12, all of the gaps that are going to be evident in PISA are there. So so I disbelieve all this multi-sectoral stuff. I disbelieve that it is not, in fact, a necessary condition of achieving high learning performance of kids emerging from school to do all this stuff. Vietnam did it in roughly ways of schooling-driven ways of doing it. So the idea that lots of things that are said are necessary conditions of success, if Vietnam did it without that, then that's a counterexample and it can't be a necessary condition. So, I mean, it might be a contributing condition and it might help some, but on the other hand, we have a country that is achieving Netherlands results in very low levels of spending, very low levels of absolute development indicators of the entering kids, and et cetera, and I think that is a really important and striking example that needs to be paid attention to, because it suggests that the learning gaps we see are the result of what happened in school. None of the difference, and the differences between the Indian kids and the Vietnamese kids are massive. None of that difference existed at age 5. It all emerged from the differential effectiveness of school.
I'll try to answer the question on greater dissemination of results and greater civic awareness of results of big assessments. So I guess, again, I can talk a bit about Pilner, which also has a student, teacher, and head teacher questionnaire. And that's enabled us to do some very interesting things with Pilner in terms of learning a lot more about backgrounds of where students are coming from, what teachers bring with them to school, what head teachers bring to school as well as students. It's been a really long road over the 4 years. I mean, that we've been working with ECAP and in working with governments to actually learn how to use their data. It's not easy. So we've been working on a data explorer, a very simple explorer in an Excel tool that's software that most people are familiar with. And we've just now started working with government people to do that. And I actually missed that workshop, unfortunately, because I heard it was really good. But that was held in Fiji, and a number of not senior ministers, but data people within the ministry attended that workshop. And what that does is, I guess, helping people learn how to ask questions about the data. That's not something that just comes to someone naturally, and so so learning how to look at what's there, ask questions about it, and explore why there might be some sort of effect on, we are developing more questions, for example, on early childhood education in those PILNA questionnaires. Does that have some kind of effect on learning? I wouldn't know at this point, but I absolutely agree with you about civic awareness, and it's actually what we've also discovered is that teachers really want to know results. PILNA is a random sample in the large countries in the Pacific. So teachers, they want to know what to do with that data and how to use it to teach better as well. So I guess that's part of an ongoing project, and that I completely agree with you that we still need to keep working on data. I mean, and getting it out there in simple ways that you can actually ask questions about it and know where to find those answers and have it be available.
In the interest of time, I'll just pick up on the gender one. Just to say, probably as a lot of people are aware, historically a lot of the focus was on the access and retention questions around gender, and that was absolutely showing that girls were more disadvantaged. So these questions of what are the effects have been explained a lot, which was about exactly what you're saying, but in reverse, about the usage of girls' time, the degree to which education is prioritized for girls, and so on. It's largely as an effect of SDG 4 and having this greater focus on learning that we're starting to see what's happening with learning outcomes, and it's being revealed that the girls are getting the better results. And so there's a bit of a catch-up now with people trying to figure this out. So there's just a small analysis, well, I don't think it was small, but it was a short report, communications, from Indonesia, where they were trying to look at this. And some of that was very preliminary, but it was looking at peer effects, for example. So the degree to which it was seen to be, useful or good for boys to be getting an education. But also the thing that I was alluding to before is the degree to which whether a boy or a young man feels that they need to have an education to still get the benefits in adulthood. So that's some pretty heavy kind of socio-cultural stuff that we have to start looking into. But I think this is something where we need to know a lot more. So some people may have attended this. In November, we hosted a big education policy forum, which was looking at Asia and the Pacific. And this was absolutely a theme that came out. And many programs and many of our partners were saying, we need to understand this. What are these factors? So this is where I'm sort of throwing to our researchers, saying this is something that absolutely bears a lot more investigation. I wouldn't want to give a glib response. But for me, it's beyond education. I think there are definitely cultural factors, and that can be pretty murky water to go into, but if we want to try to address it, we need to look at it carefully.
And I'd really like to talk about two things, the communication and the spread and dissemination. We had some really good practice. I forget who asked that question? Yeah, thanks. We did this really interesting thing in Tonga as the beginning of Pearl. They did an assessment of every single child using the Early Human Capability Index. Sally Brinkman designed it, culturally relevant to Tonga. Did it for every single child aged 3 to 5. And then to disseminate it, we held meetings in every single village. We went round, and not we, because I can't speak Tongan, but Tongans. But the way it was disseminated was through maps. What we discovered is that maps are fantastic. People love looking at maps. So we put which communities were doing better on things and which were doing worse on the 9 domains. Boy, did we get great turn up, and everyone is looking at the maps. Look, politicians love maps. Ordinary people love maps. Parents love maps. Use maps. Use maps. Right?
And healthy competition.
What?
And healthy competition.
And healthy competition. Look, use maps if you take one thing away. So that's what I mean about communication. Right. Second thing I want to say is I think we did it quite right. Okay, you asked about, somebody asked about joined up government, whole of government. We got health and education to work together and internal affairs. We did really well. Right, but we set up a special council. We got them all to turn up. We ran everything past them. We made it properly collaborative, and we got them all, and we got district officers to come in and talk to us about what they saw. It takes an awful lot of work. It hasn't survived. If you're interested in sustainability, no, it hasn't survived because, anyway, that's another story. But it worked really well. The health people gave us really good ideas. Anyway, that's the idea. It can do it. It's a good example.
Okay, thank you. All right, so next round, so we've got 20 minutes, so we're doing well. Okay, got one question, two questions, and Ali, you got a question as well? Sure, okay, I'll start here with you, sir.
Richard Curtin from the Development Policy Centre. I want to pick up on David Coleman's point about emphasising the demand side as a way of providing an incentive for people to improve their literacy and numeracy. It seems to me that DFAT has potential to provide information on the value of having improved literacy and numeracy through the programs that it runs that emphasise opportunities for labour mobility. Under the Pacific Labour Scheme, there's been a switch from focusing on semi-skilled, unskilled, basically unskilled work under the seasonal worker program to opportunities for people to work in Australia, basically requiring post-school qualifications. But unfortunately, PLS doesn't provide releasing information on the occupations of the people who are getting those jobs. We can infer it from looking at things like people are getting jobs in the meat industry. But that would be a useful way of sending a signal to people that, in fact, with post-school qualifications, they're able to get jobs in Australia. But I think there's also another way that APTC, for example, it does, I think, I was on the evaluation of it in 2014 and on the redesign of stage 3, APTC does a literacy and numeracy assessment of people who are applying to be students. Now, it could provide that information publicly to show what the standard of people who are applying compared to the standard that APTC accepts for those students to go in and do the course. At the end of the course, they do another assessment as well. So that provides very concrete feedback to populations who are interested that this is the value of improving your literacy and numeracy.
That's a great idea, Richard, thanks.
Liz Jackson from La Trobe Uni. I'm just a bit struck by this conversation and the kind of what seems to be missing is a bit around the political aspects of education reform. So in Indonesia, for example, you know, and others in the room know a lot more about it than me, but lots of investment by donors, lots of investment by the Indonesian government, lots of spending, 20% of the budget. But it seems to me that part of the reason for the failure of those reforms was, for example, a lot of that increased spending went to teacher salaries, and there was a best practice reform around teacher certification that then got kind of co-opted, and so incompetent teachers were certified and were able to keep receiving the salaries. So it just, I guess, is an observation really. We've talked a lot about kind of technically how to get better learning outcomes, but how do we address these kinds of political issues? And it kind of links to your, what you were saying on yesterday afternoon, right, about kind of best practice reforms and, but how do you actually change practice on the ground?
Exactly, thanks. And Ali?
Yes, I have a question about coming out of the research on improving systems in education work that you guys work on. And I know that you have the in-depth research case studies, I think, in Vietnam as well as Indonesia and others. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about the insights and learnings that are coming out around Vietnam and why they've got those high scores. But also for me, it was just to square something, because I'm a parent of little children now. And I kind of always assumed with Vietnam, like you said, Lant, that it's all just what happens in the school and it's all about the teachers. Whereas I kind of intuitively then, when Wendy's slide showed that preschool and being home and reading to your children and having time to devote to that
seem to have a considerable effect on their learning outcomes. I was just interested to know, like, what are they doing right in the schools in Vietnam, and has it got nothing to do with their family and the support, or what are the learnings coming out of it? Because yeah, I just find that really interesting. I'd like to square that from my own parenting.
Getting some tips on parenting.
I don't need to read 4 hours.
Thanks, Ellie. Okay, I'll just for the camera just quickly run through the questions. Okay, so Richard on Curtin on emphasising the demand side. DFAT has the potential to provide, I guess, some stronger linkages with labour mobility programs, but also then there's information within some of our labour mobility programs, specific labour scheme in particular, and APTC, in which, you know, there's, on Pacific Labour Scheme, on the occupations around there and getting some information there, and on APTC, the applicants and what their scores are coming into APTC, but also coming out. I think that's a great idea. The political aspects of education reform and some of the political economy, much could be said there, and then just unpacking a little bit more on the systems in education in Vietnam. We're working on that.
So let me just address two of those. One about politics and one a little bit about Vietnam. So part of the difficulty is we're not going into depth in what we mean by system and what we mean by a coherent system, but included in the RISE Research for Improving System Effective Framework is politics. Politics is a key element of the education system. So to the extent that we haven't mentioned politics enough, yes, politics. It is a public sector policy, and public sector policy is political. And without the political impetus and support and at least authorization of action, the ministry can't do it by itself or won't have the resources. So what we mean by a system is the politics, the way the government works, the way the individual organization providers of education work, and the way parents and communities engage with the system. Those four kinds of sets of actors and the relationships among them are what we mean by a system. And when we say a system has to be coherent in our learning, we mean the politicians actually have to be committed to doing education, which, by the way, is one of the things, a thing that makes me very nervous is that in and around the space of education, there's lots of things to be done. And I think a lot of the attention on non-basic schooling elements like training and 21st century skills and to some extent, and this is going to make everybody mad, early childhood, is that is that it's funner, easier to do anything but try and fix the schools. Because fixing the schools is going to take political capital. It's not going to get you political capital. Whereas, you know, being a donor and starting some new program of intersectoral coordination or starting some new program for early childhood, it's all swimming because you're like not reforming an existing system. But, you know, it's not going to work. If you don't fix the schools, you're not going to get good schooling outcomes, and fixing the schools is going to be tough because these systems are entrenched. They're impervious to change. The people, you know, it's just going to be tough. So yes, the politics is central to what I mean by a system and what I mean by coherence. It means you have to have political commitment. And political commitment is going to be hard to come by. That's why we want a crisis. That's why you need it to be seen as a crisis. And there's lots of funner things to do than school reform. But if you don't fix the schools, it's just not going to work. Getting a 5-year-old through a great play group into school ready, and then not actually fixing the school, it's not going to work. It's just, or it's not going to work as well as you hope. So, and then let me come to Vietnam. You know, the RISE program has large country research teams doing multi-year on 7 different countries, one of which is Vietnam. In order to understand their success, we have a political scientist, an education psychologist, an economist, and this huge team. And as the research director, I've been pestering the team. What the hell did Vietnam do? What the hell did Vietnam do? What the hell did Vietnam do? Why did Vietnam succeed? pretty much the answer I've gotten is Vietnam succeeded because they wanted to. It's not actually a technique thing, it's a will thing. And what Vietnam wanted to do is make sure every child learned. And that's what they wanted to do, and that's what, by wanting to do it, they found a way to do it even with very low resources. And so I'm not at all convinced that this is a technocratic problem, that the lack of technocratic available solutions is the problem. The problem is many systems have combined this weird emphasis that education is a selection process, not a education process where the point of education is to find out which kids are smart. And what we want to do in order to find out kids are smart is expose them to brutally indifferent teaching, and only those that are really smart will survive. And so you've combined a brutal selection system that is premised on that we don't really teach kids anything. They're either smart or they're dumb, and we're just going to expose them to a bunch of hard tasks and select the ones that can do them, with universal access. The answer to that is the great betrayal. You put a lot of people into a selection system without giving them any real, without yourself having any real commitment to actually giving them opportunity to learn, and actually really commitment to universal learning. And the result of that is lots of kids are going through and being passed through because the system was never really committed to universal education. So what Vietnam succeeded because they wanted to, and I think when systems want to, they will and can find ways to succeed. I mean, on some ways what Wendy's saying is really extraordinarily distressing. The fact that there are quick wins in education systems that have existed for 50 years just tells you the magnitude of brutal indifference to learning outcomes that have existed in those systems that have allowed those quick wins to not have already been exploited. Sure.
I'm sorry, I can't let it go. Anyone who says that getting early childhood education up is easy, frankly, has not tried to do it. I tried to do it as a bureaucrat in the Australian Public Service. It is really hard to get political support for early childhood education. Did I misunderstand
Compared
you?
to reforming teachers?
Absolutely, I agree. And I'm always annoyed that teacher programs always get more money, and I'm always there trying to get money for the early childhood, and the teacher, they're always focused on that. It's hard. Anyway, so just let me expose my own angst in this area. But you absolutely have to reform schools, and I agree. But I did work for 4 years in Vietnam on a World Bank project, and I've now worked for 6 years in the Pacific. And I agree, it's the absolute ruthlessness with which the Vietnamese want to do something. So we designed a school readiness program. We ended up designing something that they trained 240,000 early childhood teachers on the training we designed to make them play-based and child-centred and all that sort of stuff. It was extraordinary, the implementation skills Vietnam had to be able to do this. So, but there is something there. Vietnam has got more, it's actually got far more bureaucratic capacity than I've seen in the Pacific, and I think in many, so that implementation capacity is infinitely better in Vietnam, as well as all those cultural things, the parents value education more, that plays into it as well. But I saw, yes, fundamental differences in the way Vietnam does things, but it's also their capacity, which I think is, I think there are real capacity issues in many of these countries.
Just don't mention the war.
Just quickly, Ali, you're not off the hook. Parents got to read to their kids. So just really quickly, the school effects are important, the preschool effects are important, but extraordinarily important is the home environment. It's a huge predictor of success. So keep reading to your kids. So I just wanted to say really quickly, just using the Vietnam thing, just to touch on something a little bit broader. Because a very strange thing that we often observe is you get a situation where Vietnam is getting this success. And rather than being energizing, it seems to be defeating of others, because they go, oh, we couldn't possibly, look at their scores, they're unbelievable. Whereas What I would argue is Vietnam wasn't always Vietnam, just as if you think of the broader literature, Finland wasn't always Finland, right? People look at Finland as the top because of the PISA scores, right? And they go, oh, Finland, and there's I had a Finnish friend who said they would, like when she was at school, there was educational tourism. There are constantly groups coming through, what are they doing? How do we do this? But instead of it being energizing, it became sort of self-defeating. And so what I'm interested in us trying to understand, is what are these aspects of what I guess I would think of as cultures of learning. Trying to understand in a way that can be empowering and enlightening about each, say by each region, or by category. I know Jonathan told us not to think about categories, but if you want to go by region, what is the one that's going a little bit better? And what are the aspects of that? And a lot of it is going to be systems, there's going to be system elements. A lot of it is going to be politics, and in terms of the political buy-in. But, and this goes back to my demand point earlier, it also has to do with cultural mores. The degree to which a community or society is valuing education can be a driving force, right? That the community is saying, I can see benefits either intrinsically in terms of we just see education in and itself being important, and or, I think as often as described in the Vietnam example, is saying, by educating our populace we can be more successful. So you can have these outside or elements of kind of material success or whatever, but it's a combination of those things. And so rather than trying to look at Finland and just sort of being in awe and crumbling and seeing, and this is for Australia too, seeing how could we possibly do that? Or looking at Vietnam and saying, oh, that's wonderful. I mean, Korea likes to tell the story. South Korea, that in 1960, I think I have the numbers right, that in 1960, Tanzania and South Korea had the same educational standards plus all kinds of other demographic metrics. Now, poor Tanzania, because then they say, hey, look at how far we've gone and they've flatlined. So no comments about Tanzania, but they're just using that as an example to say, by force of will, we transformed ourselves. But I do not agree, even if when you had the political environment that Korea had during that period, that it can be completely enforced upon you by a government. There have to be effects from the culture that is giving a sense of demand and interest in education. And that's the stuff that I think we haven't investigated enough, is to understand and try to then energize that so that you have that combination of factors of what we're bringing in terms of trying to improve the system, but how do you get that mobilization through reading to your kids and people just being kind of more engaged, and how can we energize that and not just sort of be terrified that Finland was successful and we can't possibly, whereas trying to understand in a way that's less intimidating, either by sub-region or countries which are more similar to you, what are the elements that we can learn from across that, understanding every context is different, but there are possibly some lessons to be drawn.
Okay, now there's only 3 minutes to go, so I know there are a few more questions in the room, so let's just go with one final comment from you then, Lant. That might work. Were you going to say something? And then we'll wrap it up.
This is terrible as a final comment, but because I want to, like, I dislike nouns that exist at this hazy level of abstraction. So I dislike the word institutions, because it's an aggregation of concrete nouns like chairs and tables and then like the word furniture. The word furniture just isn't that helpful. Like, I actually want to know about chairs and tables. And like if you say countries that succeed have good institutions, it's like, great, go get me some good institutions. I don't, it's this abstract, and I'm just, don't need to be critical, but when I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun. I just don't think explanations that invoke a broad kind of word like culture are actually particularly helpful, because oftentimes there are norms of behavior, and norms are reinforced, but the norms are often endogenous to the overall system, and you can change norms very fast. So I think the danger of saying we need cultural this or cultural that is that, as an economist that's worked on economic growth, I have seen economic growth explained by the lack of culture that's conducive to economic growth right up until there is rapid economic growth. And then suddenly, Japanese culture, which was explaining the low level of Japanese performance, suddenly explains the high level of Japanese performance. And Chinese culture was really inimical to growth right up until Chinese culture promoted economic growth. And Korean, so I'm nervous about a large abstract view like culture because it can be an excuse for complacency. There probably are social features of how education is viewed and that need to be promoted in order to have beliefs in success, and I think we should focus on those, but I'm just worried about invoking culture can often actually have negative effects of saying, well, it's culture, it's long-term, it can't be changed, it's a property of them that they can't learn or won't learn, as opposed to a property of us that do learn. I'm really, really, really nervous about that kind of thing, because I think often culture gets invoked as an explanation for failure right up until their success, and then all of a sudden, oh, gee, well, it turns out we could succeed.
Fantastic. All right, well, please put your hands together.